Spinning.
I know it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Z.
makes me act the way I do.
This is Undead Live, afternoon edition, reporting live from the front lines of the zombie apocalypse. We have your back morning, noon, and night, whether you're dead, undead, recently deceased, or fully alive. Today is Friday, October 16th. I'm Athena Actipus.
And I'm Dave Lundberg-Henrik, and this afternoon we'll be looking at the diverse undead from the Wendigo of First Nations Algonquin tribes to the traditional original Haitian zombie.
We will also be looking at the zombifying role of inequality and how the zombie apocalypse may be changing our attitudes towards universal basic income.
That's right. But before that, we do have an update from Steve and Larry. I know last we talked to them, things were, I don't know, things didn't seem great.
Yeah.
And so, but they're,
let's bring
here
them
they
in.
are. So
yeah, Steve and Larry, welcome back to Undead Live. Give us an update. What's going on?
You tell us. I don't know. What do you see?
Well, listen, I want to get this out right away. I went to town just to see how the was down there, because things have been a little weird up at my place here, and I got this video. I really want you to see it. Steve, you should check this out. Dave,
Shit. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh God.
a punk or what's going on? But did you see that, Steve?
What's there not to see? What do you mean what's going on? That was terrifying. Do you think these guys were right? What's like the Channel Z people? Was that girl okay? I have a lot of questions. What's going on?
And then, what's going on with you? I mean, I just feel like
I'm fine. Stop. I'm fine. Everyone's worried about me all the time. My wife, my kids, everyone's worried. I'm fine. I'm worried about what's going on. Something's not happening. Something's not being told. Something's not going right. What did you see?
I don't know, man. My town is flipping. I got home as soon as I could after that happened, and I haven't seen anyone. But occasionally I see somebody in the distance, and I don't know if they're. I don't know what's going on, to be honest.
Oh, that's my dog. My dog. He sounds like he might taste good.
A nice new blanket you got there.
Well, it's freezing. Aren't you guys? I mean, you're in upstate, the same place I am. Kind of, it's freezing here.
Well, I decided to come down in my basement.
Is it? Where are you going? Come back, Larry. Don't leave. Where are you going? We need to be here on live for these guys.
Well, I don't know what our reporting is. My point is that in my town, I'm in upstate New York, things are getting a little batshit crazy. So that's my report. I don't really intend to venture out until I know better. I've tried to go online and see any reports, like even about what happened with the gas station thing.
Wait. Do you think these guys are right? The Channel Z people? Like, I thought this was a gag. Like, this is like a conceit. What is this real?
Well, that was a pretty elaborate stunt. If I was filming something by chance, I happened to be in town, and that's what happened. So I don't know if this is a hoax or what, but it's not making me feel good. So I'm now in my basement just because, and I'm gonna have to go outside and see what's going on if there's any developments. I mean, in the neighborhood, I'm in a pretty far out area, so hopefully
not here. I'm seeing things in the street that I don't even want to talk about. There's like folks with guns, I think. I mean, I'm not used to seeing that kind of thing around here. This shit's going down. This is not okay. We need the people at Channel Z to get this word out. I think this job we're doing is serious now. And I'm the first person to try and make a joke out of something unless there's no joke to be made. This
Okay.
serious.
I guess we'll try to keep you posted. I'm going to tell you what's going on up in my neck of the woods. I'll go out and try to take more video, and just if things start to break down, and check out my neighbors, and try to take care of my immediate surroundings. But that's really good today, I'll tell you.
I'm going to put in a call to the mayor. What?
Did anyone react? Like when you were in town, did the police show up? What happened?
Well, I'll be honest. I got the hell out of there. It just felt like things were going from bad to worse. But there weren't a lot of people. Nobody witnessed that. I mean, you saw the video. It's almost a 360, and there was nobody.
Yeah, that's really bizarre behavior, though. That's like, I don't know. Like, I've never seen that in my life. Just somebody biting another person at a gas. Like, that's weird. Like, that should.
Somebody would call somebody, right? Like, people would come unless people already know about it and they're deciding to do nothing.
I don't know. This sort of goes back to what you guys were saying when we first had you on. It's like, how the heck to react to this sort of event is.
Well, yeah.
It's confusing. It's like.
Well, it's just funny that, when we started yesterday, I had that incident with the guy looking through the window and stealing the porch. And, it just takes a long time for the brain to adjust and to say this is really happening. So.
Yeah, but at this point, this is violence just in the streets. That's not anywhere close to normal.
That's not normal. Yeah. So Steve, Larry, I really hope that you guys will, number one, keep yourselves safe, and number two, help bring us the reports from the front lines as this plays out where you are.
All right. Well, I'm going to go out, try to take some more video, and we'll report back. I guess we'll see you later today.
Be safe. Be really safe.
Yeah.
I'm going to call the mayor. I'll let you know.
Good idea. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Larry.
All right.
Thank you.
Be careful.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, I think maybe we should get back to our programming now. Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like we should just lock our doors.
Well,
but yeah,
both. Make sure that you have your go bag ready. Make sure your doors are locked. But I think we have to go on with the show. So next, we're going to take a look at capitalism and consumerism. Zombies have long served actually as a narrative, not just of disease, but also of capitalism and consumerism. Political science professor Mzilikazi Koné is here with us today to talk about how the enslaved human, one who can literally be worked to death, represents the zombified state. Mzilikazi, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello.
Hello.
Well, all right, Mzilikazi, the floor is yours. Please tell us, how is it that zombification ties in with these issues of capitalism, consumerism, the economy, labor, etc.?
Absolutely. Well, we have to take it back to how we actually got here to the so-called New World in the Americas. And the New World really begins with one thing. It begins with the transatlantic slave trade, right? That's foundational to our understanding of what happens in the Americas. So when we think about zombies, particularly zombie culture, as we understand its origins, we go back to Haiti. Okay. And we think of the embodied zombie, right? The person who has been transformed into the animated dead here. Okay. Now, this expression of the animated dead really highlights this fear of being enslaved. Now, we have to think about how long the slave trade has existed throughout the Americas, and really the crisis of that moment and what it does to people, such that even through backbreaking work, that the idea of being made into a zombie could be a threat worse than death. Right? So people are made into zombies. And really, we can think of the ways that folks have worked in faith, in witchcraft, to transform people into zombies as a threat, really, right? So what does a zombie do that a human can't do? Well, a zombie works. A zombie follows, okay? And a zombie doesn't ask for a paycheck. So when we create zombies, we see that the possession and being made into a zombie is really like a capitalist possession. And by that means that you could really be worked to death, right? For nothing, just to serve at someone else's pleasure and to be the labor for someone else. Now, this is different than the zombie astral that I have here on my altar. The zombie astral is the disembodied zombie. It's the way in which somebody's soul could really be captured, put into a nice bottle like this one, and really used by the living, right? So if you are trying to do better or be a better, better truck driver, you might want the zombie astral of a truck driver so that you have better driving skills on the road. So, in particular, when we think about Haiti looming so large, particularly for those of us who live here in the United States, and it's such a small island, you can look here to see that Haiti is an island that shares, it's on the island of Hispaniola. It's shared with the Dominican Republic, and it looms largely in American consciousness, particularly because the Haitian Revolution, which takes place after the American Revolution, is in 1791 and ends in 1804. It has a massive effect on the rest of the Americas, because when the Haitian people fight, right? And let's be more specific. The enslaved Africans brought to the Americas, when they fight and then they win in 1804, they become the first free Black republic of the Americas. And they become something out of a horror film for other nations, because, wow, what a threat. We wouldn't want other countries, other colonies throughout the Americas to know that these enslaved people fought for their freedom and won. In fact, it loomed so large that one of the earlier U.S. immigration laws was barring Haitians from arriving to the United States, right? We wouldn't want to share that knowledge about freedom and struggle. In fact, when the Haitians win the revolution in 1804, look, that is 60 years before the U.S. ends American slavery. Brazil doesn't end slavery until 1888. Can you imagine the knowledge of the Haitian people about freeing themselves from this zombification of slavery? And in fact, many people in our nation don't know that the U.S. was responsible for occupying Haiti from 1915 to 1934. Well, occupation, well, that's a nice word for showing up to someone else's country and saying, oh, this looks nice, we want this now. The North American curiosity of zombies also extends to curiosity about African diasporic religious practice in Haiti, which is thinking through things like voodoo, Haitian voodoo. So curiosity about the revolution and witchcraft and the role of witchcraft in the revolution, and in particular thinking through the ways in which folks in North America framed people in Haiti as barbaric. So interesting, considering that within the United States, we continue to have a system of slavery, and yet call those who free themselves from slavery the barbaric ones. Interesting. However, or in addition to, rather, the fact that the U.S. occupied Haiti for nearly 15 years had an effect on U.S. American popular culture, where we see, beginning in 1929, the publication of books about zombies, right? These are former Marines and military members who were in Haiti and came back with stories of zombies and witchcraft, and used those stories to kind of discuss and really publicize the nature of zombies in Haiti. Now, it is not only authors like William Seabrook and Faustin Workus who write about zombies in 1929 and 1931, but let's not forget the importance of Zora Neale Hurston in 1938, who writes Tell My Horrors and talks about the encounters of people with zombies in the modern day. So, that leads me to consider, are there zombies today? Now, when I think about that, it makes me think, when did the zombies ever leave? When were there not zombies? And particularly when we're considering the role of slavery, of Jim Crow, of segregation, right? of the othering of other people, particularly in this case, Black people and people of African descent, our ability to other them such that we don't see them even as human, as a sort of zombification, right? Look to the US Constitution, where enslaved Africans were mentioned as 3/5 of a human being, right? If that's not making someone into the undead, well, what is? We might consider those who work in our periphery, the people who exist on the margins of our society, as having a kind of central place to this narrative of they're there, but not quite there, right? The so-called, let's think about, not so-called, let's think about essential workers, right? The ways in which they're there and present in our society, and yet often made invisible at the same time, right? Think of the way of slavery, right? The US has not become a powerful nation as it has for hundreds of years without the free labor of enslaved Africans for hundreds of years. The zombification, the making of these people into the truly undead. Furthermore, let's think about the uprisings of the summer and the ways in which Black people have been made into zombies, have been considered undead. And how do we know this? Through a myriad of examples. Let's think about Breonna Taylor or George Floyd, those who even in death we had to argue for, to claim that they were in fact humans and not the undead. Are there not zombies all around us? Just some thoughts.
Mzilikazi, wow, thank you so much for sharing all of those thoughts with us.
Yes.
Yeah, I kind of want to jump in to actually ask about, what is happening right now in our country in terms of this structure of labor. There's been some major changes, right, that have happened, especially because of new technologies. And there's kind of been the emergence now of this whole other class of workers that are, gig workers, right? They've been called. And oftentimes, they're working for very little money and kind of accepting a lot of the risk themselves. Although there is sort of this, framing of autonomy around it. So how do you sort of reconcile those two issues in the gig economy in terms of, the autonomy that seems apparent, but at the same time, the inability of many of those people to have other options?
Yes, absolutely. You bring up such a good point there. It gets to my point, to the idea of the workers who are truly made marginal, right? So whether it be, and now I'm not saying that they are marginal, but by the society treating them as disposable workers, as though they were marginal, whether they're gig workers to farm workers, right? These folks that actively are creating and producing the things that we need for our everyday society, and yet who are made invisible by a lack of wages, reasonable wages, living wages, right, to survive on, a lack of attention to their health care or lack thereof, right? The risks that we are expecting them to take on behalf of patriotism, really, that they ought to take the risk, and that really in receiving small wages that one should be grateful for anything at all, right? So really, it highlights the ways in which we exist in a system where we have the living alongside the undead at all times, right? The purely existent undead. And sure, sometimes we remember them, when we have elections in this post-apocalyptic world, right? Sometimes we consider ways in which maybe we might distribute peanuts to the undead. But really, when we see these people as undead, as unable to organize, as non-human beings, then it is more difficult for us to provide them the rights, really, that they are deserving of. Right? When we see, they're not real people, they're not full humans, they don't really need full pay. Right? And that ends up being the narrative around those who are the gig workers, the farm workers, the marginal workers who are very much a part of our system and yet have been relegated, right, outside of the center.
So you were talking about sort of when Haiti, after it had its revolution, and then that was sort of like hidden. And it sort of reminded me of how now I feel like our sort of work zombie force, essentially we're hiding that, and technology is sort of allowing it, almost the change from like, I think a lot of people, if you like, I know big box stores used to always get sort of a bad reputation for not taking good care of their employees, and then we've moved to these sort of online retailers that maybe they're not taking any better care, but we don't see it because we don't go to the store. And so I don't know, that way that I don't know, I don't know what the, but you know what I mean? Like, does it seem like they're also, we're hiding the slavery itself, as well as hiding the... Sure.
Yes. I think in a way, are we hiding it? Are we hiding it, or are we choosing not to see it? I mean, the same if you order something on Amazon, do we not think about the steps and the workers who are in those fulfillment warehouses, and the ways in which, when we don't think about them, we add to making them invisible in our society, right? And the reality is those who are on the margins, even the undead, are capable of organizing. Even those who've been relegated to that status, right? They are pushing for recognition, right? The slow march towards recognition of fighting for labor rights, again, living wage, protective gear, right? PPE, even allowing them. What a word that is. Providing them, right? If you see them as human, then you provide them the tools they need to maintain their humanity. And if you don't see them as human, then why? Why provide them those tools, right? So they're relegated to that space as kind of almost an insider-outsider, invisible space. But Dave, you have an excellent point there. It is not just that those in the center who get to enjoy, life as it is in this moment, as difficult as it is. It's not just whether or not those in the center recognize the zombies. They're there. Right. They're there, right? And it would behoove us to recognize that they're all around us and to recognize them before they're knocking at your door.
Well, yeah. So I'm actually even let's say, I mean, even if we're at the point where we want, people who are zombified by this, like, I'm not necessarily opposed to them sort of knocking at doors and saying, all right, this has to stop. But I'm like wondering, how can that even happen, since, through the way neighborhoods are set up, the way businesses are set up, it's like, it almost seems like we've built this world where it's just invisible. You know what I mean? Like the people that are getting taken advantage of, like, they're rarely seen by the people in the middle, who are also now rarely seen by the people at the top, and there's like these like weird, I don't know. So what can be done, I think, would be my question, to sort of help.
That's an excellent point. I think it really speaks to having really a sort of class consciousness, right? Because there are the ways in which not only are we relegated to these really separate spaces, such that we don't see or are not kind of hip to those existing in other places or in the margins or so forth, that we have to recognize, it's not just about people in the center recognizing the people on the margins, right? The people on the margins, the zombies, those who've been made undead, are pushing for change, right? And this example exists throughout history, right? Look at the Haitian Revolution, right? The people who were made to be undead, such that they would slave until they died, that their children would become slaves and their children's children, right? That the Haitian Revolution offers us an example of when the people on the margins say no, right? Now, that exists. I mean, that is not just, we don't have to just look to the Haitian Revolution. There are many examples within our context of the US where people resisted and pushed back, literally in slave revolts and uprisings, and organizing, in class consciousness. Let's think back to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who, before he was murdered, was speaking and organizing around the Poor People's Campaign, right? So he wasn't just talking about the axis of race, but was really trying to recognize the ways in which we're subject to these things around class, and the ways in which the elites, the true capitalists, right? Because most folks, You might say you're capitalist, but most folks are workers, right? The true capitalists, right? The benefit to them to actually keep us in these separate bubbles, thinking that some are better than others, that some are really different than others. It's a sort of politics of a divide and conquer, right? But the development of a consciousness that supersedes this idea that that race should be a central dividing point. When we get to a point of really analyzing class and connecting not only on race but on class and other intersectional identities, when we can connect that way, not only will we be seen, but the struggle becomes greater, right? Those of us who think that we aren't zombies might realize that we are and that we belong in the struggle too.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking that even that sort of idea, like, because I don't know, the term zombies is sort of a weird one to even use in this context, because I feel like but people who, though, like, in a lot of ways, I think all of us are getting zombified. And I think one of the things is this sort of idea of, oh, it could be worse, right? At least we don't have official slavery. And at least, you know, wherever somebody is, people who have essential worker jobs, well, at least they're not unemployed. And people, you know, it's like every single point, I think it's easy to point to, oh, it could be worse. But, and I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out how we can be willing to risk that. I think.
Dave, can I pull in one of the comments here that I'm kind of stuck on this too ever since I saw this comment that Liz made, being stuck on this word possession, because, you know, it has these different meanings, right? It can mean ownership. Also, you know, in the context of zombies, right, we talk about possession, and, you know, in general, the idea of being, you know, possessed by something that's not you, or being self-possessed. So how does this notion, Mzilikazi, of possession kind of tie in with capitalism and labor? And do you see this as a useful sort of way of thinking about and talking about the topic?
Sure, absolutely. And I agree with you. I can see on a kind of multi-level understanding, right? Such possession, I'm thinking of the role of, you know, possessing someone, right? Through the use of magic and mysticism, right? The actual possession, right? The role and the use of magic. I think of possession, right? The ownership of things. And in this case, of people too, right? The ways in which people have been possessed and owned in that way. And then also in the ways in which our culture, largely, at least I'll speak within the context of our country here in the United States, this constant beat of the drum about ownership of things and possessing of goods and materials, right? Such that you can hop on and buy something online without thinking through the hands and the labor and the processes that it went to. It becomes made quite simple. So it really is a pushback against possession and a pushback against a capitalist possession. Not only that, so that we as individuals aren't focused solely on the ownership of other things or people, but that we can push back on the idea that capitalism and ownership is central, right? Because that's really the narrative that we're all, for the most part, working on, right? So it's a pushback, right? And the pushback of capitalism is a humanization of ourselves, right? When we are beyond buying and we are beyond capital and we are beyond, you know, that I need to work to produce because I'm only valuable when I'm producing, right? That is inherently a pushback against capital to say, no, my time is valuable. My time for myself is valuable. I am not only a producer.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh.
We have a comment from Neil I wanted to pull in. So, you know, he's pointing out that kind of what you're talking about is, you know, redesigning the fabric of capitalism, or sort of, you know, rethinking the economic system all in all. So, Mzilikazi, do you think this is a matter of redesigning capitalism itself, or of some alternative to capitalism?
Wow. I think surely there are many people and theorists who are thinking this through, but I suppose I'm on the side of needing to envision a new world, right? Capitalism has been accepted as like baseline fact, right? That it's like it exists and our system is capitalist and that's just it, right? Without really acknowledging the brilliance of so many people on our planet to imagine a new system, to imagine a new way of being and creating and treating one another, right? But that's a collective task for us all to imagine a new way of being together.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things we've sort of been talking about, ways to sort of rebuild systems and things like that. Can I ask you a question about, you were talking about the Haitian zombies, right?
Yes.
And you had the picture of the kid who came back after 16 years or whatever, right? So is that's a true story, correct? Or like,
Yes, well, Professor Zora Neale Hurston writes about it in her book as a true story, this encounter of zombies, right? So,
and so the idea was that was he like, what was the deal? He was drugged and.
yeah, so that's some of the mysticism of zombie. Mysticism meets science, really, right? So some of the conversations about being made into a zombie come out of sorcery or magic, or the use of like puffer fish, right, to make someone look dead, such that you can then rise them from the dead and keep them. So whatever combination of these things are really what we have to kind of consider when Zora Neale Hurston is writing about this zombie, right? That someone can exist and be gone for 16 years without memory of who they are, who they were, right? And that really, even that idea, right, that is represented in this example, right, that Zora Neale Hurston writes about, it really relates to our understanding not only of the system of slavery when it existed, but the memory, right? I mean, slavery doesn't just end one day and everyone's like, cool, and then you never think about it again, and generations later, no, right? Trauma is passed, it's passed through the genes, and the memory is passed down even, right? So that we need to maybe value the memory of what's happened, affirm ourselves and our memories, right? Because there's this way in which zombification makes you nothing but a worker, nothing but a follower. You don't get to be the person that has loved ones and family and people who love them and want to be with them and friends, right? That you get made into nothing but a producer. So the resistance, the pushback, right, is to push back to reclaim our humanity, all of us.
Yeah. Well, when I'm thinking about it, I'm also, because I think when I see those stories, like the combination of the sort of fictionalized or sensationalized stories, I don't know if that you were mentioning in the books, and then also some of the real stories, it does seem like they tell this narrative, and maybe they're designed to tell this narrative of, look, wherever you go, people are enslaving each other, right? Because when when people are being zombified in Haiti, they're essentially being enslaved, right? And so, but it's this interesting. It's almost like we're zombified by the message that, oh, because of who we are, things can never change. And so that, I don't know, that's what I see when I see that sort of combination of you know what I mean, stories.
Yes, I do know what you mean. But you know what, though? I would say that thinking is it's a trap, and it's created by design for you to feel like there's no way out. Right? So that if we are all trained to think, well, this is a system in which we live in, and there's no way out, and there's nothing we can do about it, then what do? Well, you just go to work the next day and keep pushing, and then order something online later to fill the void, right? So that we may all think that there's no recourse is part of the design, right? To think that there's no power or recourse or pushback. But the reality is, and we've seen it just this summer with the largest social movement in the United States ever, is that the people do have the power, and that when people do organize, right, build groups of solidarity, that there's this space to push back, right, to reclaim, and that it goes beyond, and we can't do it alone. Who alone can push off all of these ideas that we've been socialized to believe in? Who alone could do that?
You know, we were talking about this very issue yesterday in the context of how in cults often there's this notion that that is kind of pushed onto people that you have no option but to stay in, right? And sometimes that's just sort of through psychological manipulation. Sometimes there's blackmail involved. Sometimes people, get coerced into doing illegal activities they didn't realize that they were involved in because they didn't know really what the extent was of what they were doing. And then we were talking about technology also, and how we're so embedded in technology that a lot of us feel like, well, there is no way to not be addicted to our smartphones or be on email email every few hours because that's just the world that we live in. So I'm seeing a parallel now with this conversation about the economic system and this idea that, well, is there no way out because we're so far in it, or is there a way out?
Yeah. So Emily wanted to jump in on this conversation. You mind if we bring her? Up? So, hello. So,
Hi
okay.
there.
Should we just keep going? Because I actually think Athena's question was really good. Of is there a way out? Is there? So.
Yes. I mean, what is the alternative but to believe that there's a way out, right? The alternative really is to throw your hands up and to give up. I would say, right? That it's really, I guess it's like faith meets labor, right? You got to believe that there, what do they say, that another world is possible, right? I think Zen says that. If you don't believe another world's possible, then you already cut off from even challenging the way things are, challenging the status quo, right? So the first step is to maintain hope, right? To maintain, if it's even like a seed of hope, to maintain it. And it takes me to thinking through the generations of slavery, the generations of people who died, right? Who would work and toil each day, and would have nothing but to hold on to hope that freedom would arrive, right? That hope it's actually central to our collective survival, given the apocalypse and the many threats that we're facing, right? From climate change to food insecurity to, right? If we don't start with believing that we can do something about it, then we won't try.
So can I ask a question sort of based off of that? Sorry, Emily.
It's okay.
All right. No, I was just going to say, is there an example? Because like when we were talking about when Haiti, when the Haitians fought for their freedom, it sort of was a model, right? And is there when we were talking earlier about this sort of social striation, right? Is there a decent model that we can look for anywhere in society that we can say, look, we could run society like this and it could be better?
Sure. I mean, as we know in this country and political, in the political world, that there are a lot of different kinds of systems that people run on, right? Not just like capitalist systems or democratic systems even. And some of the inherent failure of other systems is not just because those other systems were like wrong in and of themselves, but that they were sabotaged by other actors and other nations, right? So I have to believe that there are other systems that might work. I mean, we can just look to smaller examples, like smaller communal examples, folks who live in a house together, right? We can think about it from a small scale and wonder how we might scale up. But I do believe, it's not a belief, there are examples around us of people surviving in smaller communities, people using trade, people who are engaging with planting their own food. People, there are examples throughout of people who are trying different ways of living. It's just a matter of whether or not the dominant system really allows for people to be different.
Thank you, Mzilikazi. One thing that I'm noticing in terms of a common thread here is this notion that, institutions often can zombify us, right? Whether we're talking about sort of, cults, or we're talking about economic systems, or we're talking about the, infrastructure of technology that we all get embedded in, which is, a set of very complex institutions. And, I think once we sort of just step back and realize, well, yes, sometimes we're zombified by institutions, but institutions are made of people, right? And so, sometimes they take on a life of their own, but fundamentally, they were set in motion by people, and they're still people, needed to propagate them, even for things that are largely automated, right? People are still at the root. So I think
that connects back to Haitian zombies, though, right? It's the idea, because Vodou emerged as a practice as a resistance against colonialism and enslavement. So this idea about the memory of trauma, including the memory of slavery, is in part resisted through voodoo by Loa and ancestor worship. So our continued prejudice against Vodou and voodoo religions is still proof of this lingering racism and ability to try to colonize certain people. Because remember, monsters are only monsters because we label them that way. We can only rebuild these systems, like we're discussing, if we change the definitions that define them. And part of that is recognizing the history and the complications that are in all of these things. So in my mind, it's impossible to talk about any of these topics involving zombies in any capacity through the Haitian Vodou lens without talking about racism.
Can I ask you? You mentioned Vodou and voodoo. What
Yes.
are those two things?
So Vodou and voodoo are two different spiritual practices, both emerging from West African diasporic practices. So the easiest way to understand this is that Haitian Vodou, V-O-D-O-U, evolved in Haiti from the slaves as a direct response to them all being put on this island and finding ways to continue to maintain their own cultures and ancestral spiritual practices and identities. So the zombie is both a fear of enslavement after death, but it is inherently also a resistance against some of the systems being pushed onto them, including things like Catholicism and Christianity. Because initially, Haitian Vodou practitioners, and this is still done today in a different way, would maybe be praying to an image of Mary that was deemed okay by their owners, but it really represented a different Loa or spirit for them. And then voodoo, capital V-O-O-D-O-O, actually evolved in New Orleans, in part because of the Haitian Vodou experience that was brought to New Orleans after the Haitian Revolution by both free Black people and enslaved people, mixed in with indigenous practices of the US and a little bit of European folklore. So while Vodou and voodoo are two different religions, there is a little bit of overlap between them.
Interesting. So, I mean,
yeah, it's a great, to have that perspective of the sort of context. And I think, Emily, your points about sort of how we talk about monsters and how we define monsters and, even the ways that, our implicit biases can be reflected in that is really important. And Mzilikazi, I'm wondering if you have anything you want to add to Emily's comments.
No, I fully agree that it's central to understanding the real role of slavery and racism as fundamental to this whole story. And in that, as Emily's noting, the story and the actions of resistance throughout, whether it be through the maintaining of an African diasporic faith and religious practice, right? That resistance, as even that practice of that faith in the midst of these horrible slave systems, as central to the development, right? As it's not just, as Emily was saying, not just being made into a zombie, but that voodoo as a practice to resist that enslavement and resist that zombification in the ways that we can look to the enslaved experience throughout the Americas, through different cultural traditions and practices. There are examples from North America to South America of resistance practices, right? So while the Haitian Revolution, it should be central and everybody should know about it, beyond that, we have to recognize that even though it's not taught in schools, right, that there's always been Black resistance through the lens of slavery. There's always been resistance through Jim Crow. There's always been resistance and organizing, right? So really, even though some of this might sound new, we do a disservice to ourselves and our community by not acknowledging that there was always pushback and spaces for resistance.
It's also interesting. It sort of brings to light, how I think religion is often thought of by people who are non-religious as sort of this means of control, but it also is a means of organizing and resistance and, hope and a lot of, I think, beneficial things. So
sure, but and religion, what's particularly important, not because religion we could think of like the role of Catholicism, right, or Christianity broadly, right? Not the only religion, but the role of ingenuity that goes to creating a religion that's kind of got this syncretic practice where you have the use of Christian and Catholic, saints and so forth to represent spirits and gods of the law throughout voodoo, for example, right? And we see those practices replicated throughout like Cuban Santeria, Candomblé in Brazil, right? So we have examples throughout the Americas of this creation of a faith where you can maintain practices from home, right? And pass those on in the midst of a culture that was trying to take away your culture and your practices and your language, right? In the midst of that, right? The practice of the faith, right? The maintaining of language from home, right? All of these as acts of resistance.
Thank you, Mzilikazi. And Emily, thanks so much for joining us too. We're going to bring in our next guest now, but we hope you guys will stay with us in the studio and can be part of our continued conversation. So we all know, of course, that the undead take many forms. And one of those forms is the Wendigo, a cannibalistic monster from the First Nations Algonquin tribes in North America. The Wendigo is able to possess a human body and create a gaunt and corpse-like appearance, often with rotting flesh. Here to tell us more about the Wendigo and its relationship to famines is anthropologist Cathryn. Cathryn, can you hear us?
You were just fading out there for a moment, but I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome to Undead Live. We're very much looking forward to hearing your perspective on the Wendigo and famines.
Hello, everyone. So the Wendigo is a cannibalistic monster from First Nations Algonquian mythology, and it takes the form of a spirit that possesses a human body. Its appearance is gaunt and corpse-like. It has a heart of ice, sometimes described as a giant, as being as tall as a giant. And it's always ravenous, it's always really emaciated, and it's always searching for new human victims. And it's said that a Wendigo can be created when a person starts to consume a loved one who's died of starvation. And once you start along that path, you continue until you go on a murderous cannibalistic binge eating spree. And one of the cures actually that were used in rituals was to provide bear fat for a person who was afflicted by the Wendigo spirit, because bear fat contains, of hibernating bears, contains a lot of nutrients that could be important to a person who's starving. Another way that a person could become afflicted by a Wendigo and become a cannibal is through selfish behavior, through not looking after other people in their community in the way that they should. So it's important to note that in these Algonquian traditions, cannibalism is ordinarily looked at as being extremely horrifying, and the fear of becoming a cannibal is also considered horrifying. And that's because these traditions are based on a mobile hunter-gatherer kind of system where people are sharing a lot, where the community is very tightly knit and sharing is really important. People are interdependent upon each other. And then some people have also interpreted the Wendigo as being a metonym for the colonial hunger for indigenous bodies, indigenous culture, and indigenous lands. So while there are societies in which cannibalism is practiced during war or in rituals, there's also a very widespread taboo on cannibalism. So even in societies where there's some kind of ritual practice of cannibalism, it's also considered to be morally wrong or abnormal to eat people on an everyday, day-to-day basis. And however, taboo-breaking cannibalism is found in many different historical contexts where famines occur. So there are numerous biblical references to cannibalism, theft, child abandonment, and other antisocial behaviors. For example, in the siege of Samaria, which is described in the second book of Kings, it describes how the king of Israel and his people were trapped inside the city of Samaria by an Aramean siege, which led to terrible famine. And in the Bible, in chapter 6, verses 26 to 29, it reads as follows. As the king of Israel was passing by the city wall, a woman cried to him, "Help me, my lord the king." And the king replied, "If the Lord does not help you, where can I get help for you? From the threshing floor? From the winepress?" And then he asked her, "What's the matter?" And she answered, "This woman here said to me, 'Give up your son so we may eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son.' So we cooked my son and ate him. And the next day I said to her, 'Give up your son so we may eat him.' But she had hidden him." And child eating and cannibalistic curses were often included in ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties. So, for example, the vassal treaties of the Assyrian king Assadin in the year 672 BC was forced on 9 conquered vassal states, bordering states, and it includes the threat of a scorched earth policy to any vassals who are disloyal to the conquering king. And it reads, "Mother shall bar the door to her daughter. May you eat in your hunger the flesh of your children. May through want and famine one man eat the other's flesh." So there are also many reports of famine cannibalism occurring in medieval Europe. For example, in the Great Famine during the years 1315 to 1317, and this famine stretched from the British Isles all the way to Poland. It was caused by excess rains, but it was worsened due to the several wars that were going on in Europe at the time. And the folk tale of Hansel and Gretel is thought to date to this time. Of course, you have 2 children who are abandoned in the forest, and then they're almost consumed by a cannibalistic witch. Likewise, the story of Jack and the Beanstalk is thought to date to this time. Over there, it's set in the time of a famine, and there is a cannibalistic giant. So in medieval times in general, outsiders like witches and Jews, Orientals, pagans, or any others who have thought to have strayed from the path of God are portrayed as cannibals or giants. And also during the colonial expansion of Europe, rumors of cannibalism were used as a justification for subjugating and dehumanizing the non-European other. So what you see over here is a panel from a German newspaper in the year 1571. And the caption reads, "A terrifying yet truly cruel famine and plague haunted the lands of Russia and Lithuania, occurring in the year 1571. So a bit of context, Russia invaded Lithuania as part of the Livonian War at that time. So the newspaper article is reporting on how war brought famine and plague to a previously fertile land, and it interprets this horror as a punishment from God. And it refers to a man killing 13 people for his household to eat. And also parents apparently ate their own children, and siblings murdered one another and stole from one another. Execution victims were eaten directly off the gallows, and the breaking wheels, you can see that occurring in the background of the panel over there. So there are also some modern examples of famines for which there's good evidence of antisocial behavior and cannibalism, including the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s, the Great Leap Forward Famine in Mao's China from 1959 to 1961, or the Soviet famine that occurred in 1931 to 1934. And one of the most horrifying features of severe famines is that there is often a human cause to them. So they tend to result from wars, from imperialist expansion, or despotic political regimes depriving dehumanized others of food. So, for example, Britain under Churchill exported so much rice from Nepal in India that 3 million people died there. There was drought at the time, but in order to support the war effort, Britain was exporting rice from this drought-stricken region. And this photograph over here was taken in 1933, and it shows Ukrainian victims of the Holodomor, which literally means genocide through starvation. So this was part of the famine that occurred during the Soviet Republic under Stalin. But Stalin's policies towards Ukraine were particularly cruel because of the independence movement in Ukraine at the time. So households, food was confiscated from households, and there was also a restriction of population movement, so people could move in search of food. And the Soviet regime actually convicted 2,500 people for committing cannibalism during the Holodomor. According to the historian Timothy Snyder, he says that the good people died first, those who refused to steal or to prostitute themselves died, those who gave food to others died, those who refused to eat corpses died, those who refused to kill their fellow man died, parents who resisted cannibalism died before their children died. Now, during World War II, 36 conscientious objectors participated in a study of human semi-starvation at the University of Minnesota in an effort to understand the physiological and the psychological effects of starvation. And this was done in an effort to understand and provide relief to famine victims in Europe and Asia at the time. So they underwent 6 months of a semi-starvation diet and then 12 weeks of a restricted rehabilitation diet. And the participants lost over 25% of their body weight, and they experienced some very severe side effects, including low heart rate, anemia, fatigue, apathy, extreme weakness, depression, irritability, quarrelsomeness, social withdrawal, irrational hatred, and neurological deficits of various kinds. Food became an obsession to them, and some participants engaged in self-harm. Now, this is a photo from my fieldwork in 2016 with the Ik of northern Uganda. And as you can see from this photograph of this elder, the Ik are often exposed to hunger. They live in a very harsh environment, and you can see that his body is as emaciated as the participants of the Minnesota starvation study that you saw in the previous slide. And yet things have been much worse for the Ik. So in the years 1964 to 1967, a British anthropologist by the name of Colin Turnbull visited the Ik, and he wrote a book in which he described them as unfriendly, uncharitable, inhospitable, and generally mean as any people can be. And he also described them as the loveless people. So he documented lots of selfish behavior, including stealing and hiding food, child abandonment, and mistreatment of the elderly. And he argued that this was a cultural adaptation to conditions of scarcity. But there's a problem with that explanation. So according to Turnbull's own account, the Ik experienced a severe famine during the time that he spent with them, which worsened during the course of his stay. And these photographs are photos that he took of people who later succumbed to famine. They died. And so people were actually becoming weaker and more desperate as he was staying with them, and the famine was getting worse and worse. So his explanation of this behavior being a cultural adaptation to conditions of scarcity is somewhat suspect. And during my own field work with the Ik, I found that their culture is in fact oriented towards mutual aid and towards sharing rather than towards selfishness. So I think what we can learn from this is that in extreme famine conditions, that the ordinary cultural adaptations of mutual aid are likely to break down, and people might not survive that. So in a recent book by the zoologist Bill Shute called Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History, he notes that cannibalism is very widespread in the animal kingdom in conditions of scarcity, of extreme scarcity. And he warns us of the likelihood of the outbreaks of cannibalism, not only in our own species, but in other species, if the world continues down its current path of climate change. And that's likely to cause lots of famine, diseases, and overcrowding in the more resource-rich areas. And his thoughts in this book mirrored my own morbid anxieties that I experienced while doing fieldwork with the Ik. One of the elements that I find the most disturbing is the possibility that the most vulnerable people in the world will be abandoned to this hellscape that is famine conditions. And to some extent, that's already happening in various places in the world as people are left to deal with the effects of climate change on their own. And going back to the Wendigo, then, I would add to this idea that already exists that it symbolizes the threat of hunger, it symbolizes the threat of selfish behavior in conditions of extreme scarcity, that it also represents the dehumanization of people who are starving to death. So horror stories of cannibals and zombies and vampires, wendigos and giants are gripping and terrifying to us because they represent this deep fear that we have of the human capacity to turn on one another when things start to go wrong, when we run out of resources, and when social norms and the social order start to break down. So there are motifs that remind us of the dangers of social breakdown and also the dangers of losing our own humanity in the process of dehumanizing the suffering of other people.
Thank you for that really, really insightful talk. I'm going to bring in Emily, our monsters correspondent, so that she can share her thoughts.
Emily, you might be muted.
I am muted. I apologize. I was just saying thank you, Cathryn, for that excellent summary of the Wendigo myths and sort of some of the main interpretations of it. I think one thing that's worth mentioning too that ties back to the Haitian zombie is the demonization of the indigenous people by Europeans. So the first written accounts of Wendigo occur in the 17th century, but they really gained traction in the 18th and 19th when European fur traders were beginning to place themselves in these communities. And they actually confused some aspects of the Wendigo with their werewolf. But one thing that popped up was this idea of Wendigo psychosis, which is now largely believed to be a racist interpretation of these myths. So this idea was one that floated around in psychology for some period of time that basically stated that only certain people, certain indigenous people could have this form of mental illness that led them to believe they were a Wendigo. But no one who ever supposedly had this Wendigo psychosis was ever actually studied or formalized. So it's just another example, I think, of how monstrosity is placed upon others by people in positions of power to gain control over them in some capacity.
Thank you, Emily. Also, I want to kind of pull things back, big picture here, Cathryn. So you kind of have an interesting thesis that has two sides, right? One is that on one hand, these monsters sort of represent our fear of what might happen if the social order breaks down. But at the same time, with your field work, you've seen that, these people who were sort of demonized for being selfish actually have a culture of cooperation. And indeed, that has kind of resurged in the time since Colin Turnbull did his work. Would you leave us with just some kind of big picture thoughts about that sort of paradox?
Yes, I think this also goes back to what Mzilikazi was saying earlier about the need for hope. So actually, humans are quite well adapted to helping one another and using that as a kind of insurance policy for difficult times. But if we allow ourselves to dehumanize each other and to not extend help, to kind of write starving people off as somehow monstrous, then we become monsters, and we can then, then this monstrous world will overtake us. So, we really need to hold on to our humanity in a way, and we've seen the ick do that, so that should be cause for hope.
I just want to jump in and respond to Liz's question that we just saw up there, right? In what ways can we continue to disrupt the myth that scarcity leads to selfishness and resource hoarding and combat the dehumanization that this leads to? I think one way we can do this is by telling stories like the one Cathryn mentioned, right? In my interpretation of the Wendigo, it's not just about scaring people into not eating, each other. It's about the community. It's about cooperation and collaboration, that of course you're going to want to share your resources because it benefits that individual and yourself. And I think that sort of mythology or folklore type of thinking is a way to integrate these ideas into society in a way that seems more approachable maybe than some others.
Wonderful. Thank you, Emily. And thank you again, Cathryn, for joining us.
Thank you.
Next, we're talking to anthropologist Ed Hagen about zombification and mental health and the surprising idea that depression might sometimes act as a defense against zombification. So, Ed, welcome to Undead Live.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Would you give us your perspective here? How is it that depression potentially can protect us against zombification?
So I want to push the theme of zombification and exploitation by other humans into our most intimate relationships. So when we are infants and young children, the flow of benefits is one way from parents and older relatives to us. And that's because we can't really provide any benefits in return at that very young age. But as we move into middle childhood and adolescence, we increasingly are able to provide benefits to others. We can perform childcare, we can do chores, we can get food and water. And that then raises the risk that the balance of benefits that we're receiving might not begin to compensate for the benefits that we're now beginning to provide to others. In other words, we're increasingly, as we gain capabilities of providing benefits to others, we're increasingly at risk of being exploited by others. Actually, worldwide, working for the family instead of going to school among kind of middle-aged kids is very, very common. And then, of course, as we move into adolescence, especially for young women, can now provide sexual and reproductive benefits and are increasingly at risk of being exploited sexually as well. And this risk is going to be with us for the rest of our lives. We are going to constantly be having to negotiate the benefits we provide to others in exchange for the benefits we receive in return. And the potential for exploitation exists at work, of course, obviously, as many speakers here have talked about, but it also exists in our romantic relationships, our sexual relationships, in our friendships, in our families. Anytime that we are providing benefits, there's always the risk that we are putting out more than we're getting back. And the question is, given that this is a constant threat, a lifetime threat, how can we defend ourselves against this, especially when we might be in relatively weak social positions such as when we're kids or adolescents. And one defense is physical strength, physical formidability. We can physically resist, we can get angry, we can threaten to use physical violence in case the exploitation gets too strong. We can kind of demand our fair share of benefits. And there's quite a bit of research now that physical formidability in the form of upper body strength, in fact, does predict your likelihood of getting angry when things don't go your way, your likelihood of demanding more resources, in essence, resisting exploitation by others and perhaps even exploiting others. But what about the rest of us that are not physically formidable? Do we have any strategy? And this is where I argue that depression might come in. So depression involves negative emotions, feeling sad. But one of the major symptoms is loss of interest. We stop doing things. We stop providing benefits. So I analogize this to going on strike. We are simply in situations of adversity and potential exploitation. We simply stop providing benefits until we start receiving sufficient benefits in return. So what evidence is there for this idea? Well, in the big picture, prevalence of depression is quite low in childhood. And then it sharply increases in middle childhood and especially in adolescence. And it remains pretty high, around 10% or more throughout life, at least at the population prevalence level here. And it's especially high in women, about twice as high. And the evidence is overwhelming that depression is caused by adversity. But one of the facts that is very well established, but I think not very well recognized, is depression is intimately bound up with conflict with social partners and others. Assault, rape, mugging, robbery, hugely potent predictors of a depressive episode. Serious serious marital problems, getting fired from your job, legal problems, divorce, separation, serious difficulties at work, getting along with close social partners, financial problems. All of these are very, very potent predictors of depression. And if we focus in on work-related depression, for example, again, there's overwhelming evidence that exploitative work conditions are strongly associated with and probably a cause of depression, not getting fairly compensated, not having control over decision-making at work. And what we see in response, again, very well documented, but not very well widely recognized, is in addition to being intimately bound up with conflict, depression is also very strongly associated with anger. It's often referred to as kind of repressed anger. So my question was, one of the tests I wanted to do of this is to see if actually physical formidability was protective against depression, if upper body strength protects you, number one. And number two, because there is such a huge sex difference in upper body strength, with men being much, much stronger than women, could this potentially explain the huge sex difference in depression, that women are depressed, not because they're women, but because they're physically less formidable on average than the rest of the population? So to test this idea, I looked at data collected in called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, NHANES. It's conducted every year in the United States on 2-year cycles. It's a nationally representative sample of adults, and it collects a huge amount of health-related information. It has 15 mobile laboratories that conduct numerous physical and biological tests, including a measure of depression on the one hand and a measure of grip strength on the other. And it also measures many, many potential confounds. So first look at the data. What we see is that a 2 standard deviation, basically a big increase in grip strength from low strength to high strength, upper body strength, cuts your risk of depression in half, odds ratio of 0.4. Now, there's many confounds here. Physical strength is correlated with height, which can give you social benefits. It's correlated with weight. Obesity is a risk factor for depression. It's also correlated with grip strength. So fortunately, NHANES measures all those. We controlled for all those. And after controlling for those kinds of confounds, we still see that upper body strength protects you from depression. Other confounds might be socioeconomic, high income. You might have time to go to the gym and work out. High education, you might know to maintain your health. We control for those, and physical formidability still is strongly negatively predicting depression. And then, of course, there's all the physical health confounds. Physical grip strength is a really good indicator of physical health problems, and those could be what are causing the association or negative association of upper body strength and physical formidability with depression, the negative association there. So we controlled for all these physical health problems, chronic health problems like asthma, diabetes, cancer, stroke, arthritis, emphysema, heart disease, physical disabilities, inability, needing to use crutches or wheelchairs or special equipment. And Haynes measures white blood cell count. Could it be infections? They measure red blood cell count. Could it be anemia? We control for all those things. Hormones, testosterone, thyroid hormone is well known to be a risk factor for depression. We control for all those. And after controlling for all those, we still see a strong protective effect of grip strength and upper body strength against depression, number one. And we see that it explains about half of the effect of sex on depression is mediated by physical strength. So at least as a preliminary or an early test of our hypothesis, it looks like being physically formidable protects you from depression, and our explanation would be because that physical strength is protecting you from exploitation by others and adversity in general. So that's my spiel.
Thank you so much, Ed. I'm inviting everybody make comments so we can bring them in. We have to move right along to our next talk. Our next guest, Daniel Nettle. So I have to say, Ed, though, thank you very much for being with us. It was both distressing and uplifting at the same time.
Yeah. Also, I'm gonna go hit the gym after this is done. So.
Yeah, you should. That's a good idea. Fight that depression with some upper body strength.
So, all right. Shall we bring on our next guest?
Yes. So today we've seen how the zombie apocalypse can exacerbate inequality, but have attitudes about inequality changed since the zombie apocalypse? Here to talk with us about changes in support for universal basic income is behavioral scientist and expert on the origins and consequences of inequality, Daniel Nettle. Daniel, welcome to the show.
How nice to see you.
Thank you so much for being with us here today. So tell us, what has been changing in terms of attitudes regarding universal basic income since the beginning of the apocalypse?
Well, we started studying this. So my colleagues and I were testing the hypothesis in our research that people's political attitudes are not fixed, but vary with the situation. So someone who's a tremendous individualist in peacetime might suddenly become a collectivist in war. And we were doing this by giving people kind of hypothetical scenarios. Imagine a society that's at war. What would you think would be a good way of running that society? And we were just trying to do this. And then, of course, the apocalypse actually happened. We thought, well, we don't have to give people hypothetical scenarios anymore, right? We just say, how are your opinions changing? And we alighted on universal basic income because obviously it's a topical kind of idea. And it's an interesting idea that has kind of intuitive appeals. It's very simple. Wherever you come from on the political spectrum, it's a way of including people and putting a floor under human distress and therefore making society kind of circulate better and function better. And yet it seems a kind of intuitively odd idea. Why would you give people resources, give them a benefit for which they seem to be providing nothing in return, and there's no conditionality? So it's a kind of intuitively paradoxical policy that it seems to make a whole lot of sense in one way and violate some very deep intuitions we have as humans in another. But we started to notice with the pandemic, lots of people writing articles and blogs saying, that universal basic income idea, I never was really quite sold on that, but suddenly now I see the appeal. So we thought, well, that's interesting. That might be an example of our hypothesis. People's views are changing as their world is changing in front of them. So we've done now a total of 4 surveys. We couldn't really do a longitudinal study because obviously we hadn't had the forethought to start the year before the pandemic. But we just said, here's what a universal basic income is. Do you think that's a good idea now there's been this pandemic? And do you think that would have been a good idea if things had continued as normal with no apocalypse? And across all 4 surveys, we find a real increase in support for the idea. And actually, people can give us good reasons why that's true, right? That they say it's really important in this time that the world is changing unpredictably. We don't know who the people in need are. So the whole premise of welfare systems, that you can kind of tell who the needy are and you can kind of identify them as a separate category and bureaucratically assess them. We can't do that now. Things are changing by the week and by the month. and who knows where the economy is going. So we're subject to this very great unpredictability that we kind of can't track bureaucratically. And it just suddenly starts to make a lot of sense to people. We get really big effect sizes. We need something simple. We need to kind of make life manageable and not too stressful and uncontrollable for people. But governments simply can't figure out who are the deserving and the undeserving, given the constraints we're under. And people themselves don't know if they're deserving or undeserving, because what's going on in their industry or their town this week might be entirely different by next week. So we think those are the reasons that are driving this kind of big increase in support, which we've just been working on this now, and we've most recently done a couple of surveys in September. We still find very high support for pandemic times compared to normal times, though not as high as the first surveys we did back in April and May, where people were really, our respondents were really strongly saying, US and UK respondents, this sounds like a great idea. This is exactly what we need. Sadly, our governments have not, taken this mantle up. So here in the UK, we have a complex patchwork of conditional schemes. People who meet this category can apply for this kind of assistance. Companies of this category can apply for this kind of loans. There are special schemes for the arts. There are special schemes for zoos. There are special schemes for all kinds of people whose lives have been affected. And in a way, what we're sort of saying is, look, how many special schemes do you have to have with the bureaucratic monitoring before you say, what? It might just be easier to have one general scheme and make it very simple. So that's my pitch. I'd be interested to see if you have comments about it.
Dan, that's really fascinating. I just want to jump right in because, a bunch of what we have seen in the Human Generosity Project, which is a research project that I co-lead with Lee Cronk, and actually Cathryn, her work with the IC is also a part of that project. We've seen this pattern where people can kind of flexibly shift from a sort of account keeping mentality into a more need-based mentality where there is not this sort of debt credit accounting. And that switch seems to be really tied into how predictable or unpredictable people think that these particular needs are. And so we've seen that now across a few of our field sites, that this comes up as a general principle, and also in some systematic surveys for those kinds of needs that are most unpredictable, people expect least that they will get repaid. So what you're talking about seems like kind of an institutional level instantiation of that, sort of with, universal basic income essentially being a system where there is not a debt credit kind of transaction happening, and people might be more tolerant of that, like you're saying, because of this increased uncertainty. That's right.
I think that could well be what's going on. I mean, there's always a debt credit mentality, right? And it's interesting, in the universal basic income literature, there are lots of discussions about, do you have to do anything at all to get it, right? Do you have to, there's this idea of a participation income that maybe if you volunteer, or, you at least stay out of prison, you at least vote, you at least do certain civic responsibilities. So there's always a sense of there are some kind of social obligations that exist, right? At the very least, you need to be a citizen. You need to not break the laws, right? You need to not claim 2 universal basic incomes, So there's always a sort of some sense of an eligibility criterion. But I think that the way welfare systems have evolved in, certainly in Western Europe in the last 50 years, are very much premised on the idea that there are particular categories of people: the disabled, the elderly, people from certain industries, people who are, for cyclical reasons, are unemployed, who can kind of demonstrate their eligibility. But in an unpredictable world, I mean, all kinds of people who were very prosperous before the pandemic really don't know what their livelihood's going to be now, and this is a completely different kind of problem. In one survey, we asked people, do you think pandemic has increased stress for people? Everyone said, yes, of course it has. Then we said, has it increased stress for people who are already on welfare, or more for the people who weren't previously on welfare? And it seemed like what they were saying is, actually, now we're all like the people who were previously on welfare, because we're all in the sense of unpredictability. So the only solution to that is you have some sort of very broad coverage system, and just sort of bypass the kind of bureaucratic and administrative difficulties of kind of trying to keep tabs on all that.
Yeah, Carlo's comment here, I think resonates with that a lot, that, with universal basic income, you don't have all of those layers of bureaucracy. And, because there isn't a account keeping debt credit going on, you don't have these issues of cheating, right? I mean, maybe you have some eligibility criteria, but they're much smaller and, much less of an issue for monitoring.
But hopefully you don't have behavioral disincentives, right? So if if you have any kind of conditional benefit, always creates an incentive at the margin to, if you work more than 16 hours a week, you lose your benefit. So you should work 15 and a half, right? There's always these kind of problems. But with a genuinely unconditional benefit, actually a lot of those behavioral disincentives kind of go away, which is, which is an interesting feature of the policy. It means actually, it's unclear really whether it's people from the left or people from the right who should be favoring this, right? Because it kind of speaks to both the sort of you need to incentivize people school of thought and the you need to support people through solidarity school of thought, right? It can kind of appeal to both of those.
Daniel, thank you so much. I encourage everyone, send us your comments. We are going to move right along to our imaginary correspondent now. Daniel, thank you so much. That raised my spirits.
Yeah, it was a nice ray of hope.
Yes.
So when we were talking about some tough stuff.
Definitely. So next, Bob Beard, our imaginary correspondent, is here with us. Bob, we're anxious to hear your thoughts.
This has been an incredible discussion, and it just sort of reminds me of a passage from Mark Fisher in a book called The Weird and the Eerie, where he's talking about his preoccupation with the strange, and he sort of slices these ideas, the weird and the eerie, and the weird being something that doesn't belong, but eerie is about what sort of agent is at work, and really his argument is that capital is a very eerie entity because it's conjured out of nothing, but it exerts influence across everything. And I think that's what we're coming to in these discussions about economies and UBI and labor exploitation. So this has been a fascinating conversation.
Thanks, Bob. I understand you have a question for Mzilikazi that you'd like to ask.
Yeah. So one of the first things that struck me in your talk is you were talking about these documentation of these Haitian zombies by military veterans. Is that correct?
Yes. So discussing their experiences in Haiti and really framing their experiences and their stories. I mean, they really place themselves in the stories of Haiti, and they're learning about what zombies are and the culture. So, but in those books, they are like the protagonists. In some ways, it's kind of like a colonial fantasy, right? Because if to be fantasizing about zombies is to be fantasizing about free labor, right, or control, then in placing, and in particular through the lens of colonization and the U.S. occupation, when you have folks talking about it, it is like a return to that fantasy of like, yes, I, as this white person in Haiti, was crowned the king of this group or so forth, right? Mm-hmm. So it's zombie meets colonial fantasy.
Yeah, I was, thinking about sort of being a military veteran, a Marine Corps veteran, right? We're told about, sort of all of these, noble conflicts, and one being the Banana Wars, which were essentially the protection of U.S. interests and the protection of the profits by the United Fruit Company. And there's a great book by a Marine Corps veteran who says, he participated in all of these campaigns, and he says, I was a gangster for capitalism. And thinking about military veterans writing about zombies, right? It just makes me think about, exploited workers seeing the humanity in other exploited workers. So, hopefully there's a hope there that we can, start rewriting some stories.
Truly. I mean, especially when you think about the narrative of U.S. military intervention globally and how often that really is along actual lines of capital and supporting corporate interests, right? Particularly when we think about the mythology around war, which is, especially from our perspective in this country, is usually about the democratization of other countries, right? So there is a myth that you have to like drink and believe in, and only to be confronted with the reality on the ground is like, oh, is this about capital? And often, it is.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. Thank you so much for your chat.
Thank you.
Thank you both. This was a really amazing session. We have some phenomenal comments, so make sure you go in and look in YouTube. And just in general, I'm so grateful for all of you, Mzilikazi, Bob, all of our guests today. Thank you so much for sharing your brains with us. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the afternoon edition of Undead Live. Tune in to Dr. Zed coming up next here on Channel Zed.
It's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.